The small boy's hair fell to the floor in long, dark strands. Each cut of the scissors severed more than hair. It severed a connection to his mother, who had lovingly braided it that morning, to his grandfather who taught him that hair carries spiritual strength, to centuries of tradition. This was day one at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and for thousands of Native American children across the United States, this moment marked the beginning of a systematic attempt to erase their very existence as Indigenous people. But this wasn't how the story was sold to the American public. In newspapers and government reports, these institutions were heralded as benevolent projects of civilization, places where savage children would be transformed into productive Christian citizens. Photos showed neatly dressed children in uniforms, sitting in orderly classrooms learning trades. Progress, they called it. Education, they insisted. What the photos didn't show were the tears, the punishment cells, the unmarked graves, and the children who never made it home. How did the United States government, religious organizations, and countless individuals convince themselves that tearing children from their families was an act of kindness? What drove an entire nation to participate in what would later be recognized as cultural genocide? The answer lies in a toxic combination of racist ideology, religious zealotry, and cold political calculation that would devastate generations of Indigenous families. In the late 1800s, the so-called Indian Wars were drawing to a close. The United States had largely succeeded in confining Native peoples to reservations, but government officials and social reformers faced what they saw as the Indian problem. How could they ensure that Indigenous peoples would never again pose a threat to American expansion? How could they break the cycle of resistance that persisted despite military defeat? The solution they devised was as simple as it was cruel: target the children. As Richard Henry Pratt, founder of Carlisle, infamously declared, the goal was to kill the Indian, save the man. Between 1869 and the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes and placed in over 350 boarding schools across the country. Some were taken by force, with government agents and police literally kidnapping children from their families. Others were coerced through threats. Parents who refused to send their children could lose their government rations, be imprisoned, or have their parental rights terminated entirely. Still others were convinced by missionaries and officials who promised education and opportunity, preying on parents' hopes for their children's futures in a rapidly changing world. What awaited these children was not the education and care they had been promised. Instead, they entered institutions designed to strip away every aspect of their identity. Upon arrival, children were given English names, often assigned arbitrarily from lists. Their traditional clothing was burned. They were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their religions, or maintain any cultural customs. The punishment for speaking even a single word in their mother tongue could be severe: beatings, confinement in dark basements, or being forced to kneel on hard floors for hours. Some schools used more creative cruelties. Children caught speaking native languages might have their mouths washed with lye soap or be forced to wear signs declaring their savage behavior. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. What followed would be years of what survivors would later describe as soul murder, a deliberate, methodical attempt to kill the Indian within each child while keeping the body alive to serve American society's needs. The idea didn't emerge overnight. In the years following the Civil War, American society was grappling with questions of citizenship, civilization, and what it meant to be truly American. For many white reformers and government officials, Native peoples represented the antithesis of American values. They were communal rather than individualistic, spiritual rather than Christian, and connected to the land in ways that conflicted with American concepts of private property and resource exploitation. The roots of the boarding school system can be traced to earlier colonial efforts to civilize Indigenous peoples. As early as the 1600s, missionaries had attempted to convert and educate Native children, but these efforts were sporadic and localized. What changed in the late 1800s was the scale and systematic nature of the approach. This was no longer about individual missionaries trying to save souls. This was about the federal government implementing a comprehensive policy of cultural erasure. Richard Henry Pratt, a former military officer who had fought in the Indian Wars, became the architect of this new approach. His experience with Native prisoners of war at Fort Marion in Florida convinced him that Indigenous people could be reformed through strict military-style discipline and complete immersion in white culture. In 1879, he founded Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, which would become the model for hundreds of similar institutions. Pratt's philosophy was breathtakingly arrogant and deeply racist. He believed that Native cultures were inferior and that Indigenous peoples could only survive in modern America by completely abandoning their heritage. His famous quote, "Kill the Indians, save the man," wasn't metaphorical. It was a mission statement that would guide federal Indian education policy for decades. But even before Carlisle opened its doors, warning signs of what was to come were evident. Pratt's experiment at Fort Marion had already shown the devastating effects of forced assimilation. Many of his prisoners became deeply depressed, some attempted suicide, and several died from diseases their bodies had no immunity against. Rather than recognizing these as signs that his approach was harmful, Pratt saw them as unfortunate but necessary casualties in the march toward civilization. The first students at Carlisle were recruited from the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples, tribes that had recently been defeated in military conflicts with the United States. Parents were told their children would learn skills to help them navigate the new world being forced upon them. Some genuinely believed this might give their children advantages in dealing with white society. Others recognized it as another form of captivity but felt they had no choice. What made the boarding school system particularly insidious was how it exploited legitimate Native concerns about their children's futures. By the 1880s, many indigenous communities were facing starvation on reservations, their traditional ways of life destroyed by white settlement and government policies. When school recruiters promised food, clothing, and education, some parents saw it as the only way to ensure their children's survival. The government's approach was calculating and manipulative. Officials would arrive at reservations during the harshest winter months when food was scarce. They would showcase photographs of well-fed children in clean uniforms, promise that children would learn trades and skills, and sometimes offer small payments to families. What they didn't mention were the deaths from disease, the brutal punishments, or that many children would never return home. Church organizations eagerly partnered with the government in this enterprise. Various Christian denominations saw the boarding schools as mission fields, opportunities to save heathen souls while receiving government funding. This partnership between church and state created a powerful alliance that made resistance even more difficult for Native families. To oppose the schools was to oppose not just the government but God himself, or so families were told. The speed at which the system expanded reveals how central it was to federal Indian policy. Within a decade of Carlisle's founding, dozens of schools had opened across the country. By 1900, there were 147 federal boarding schools in operation, with thousands more children in mission schools. The Bureau of Indian Affairs allocated massive budgets to these institutions, seeing them as more cost-effective than military campaigns. But this rapid expansion came with a dark calculation. Officials knew that separating children from their families would cause tremendous pain. Internal government documents from the period show that policymakers understood they were inflicting trauma. They simply didn't care. Or rather, they saw this trauma as necessary. Breaking family bonds was essential to breaking tribal identity. As more schools opened, a pattern emerged that would define the boarding school experience for generations. Children as young as 4 were taken from their homes, sometimes not seeing their families for years. The journey to school itself was often traumatic. Children were loaded onto trains or wagons, watching their parents grow smaller in the distance, not understanding when or if they would return. But this was only the beginning of a systematic process designed to erase every trace of their indigenous identity and rebuild them as manual laborers and domestic servants for white society. The transformation began the moment children crossed the threshold. Within hours of arrival, every visible marker of their indigenous identity was systematically removed. The process was deliberate, methodical, and designed to shock. Boys had their hair shorn close to the scalp, a particularly cruel act given that many tribes considered long hair sacred, a connection to spiritual strength and cultural identity. Girls' hair was cut into short, uniform bobs. Traditional clothing was stripped away and burned in front of the children, replaced with stiff military-style uniforms for boys and Victorian-style dresses for girls. But the physical transformation was only the surface of a much deeper system of control. The schools operated on strict military schedules, with every moment of the day regimented. Children woke before dawn to the sound of bells or bugles. They marched in formation to meals, to classes, to work assignments. They were assigned numbers and were often called by these numbers rather than even their assigned English names. The message was clear. You are no longer an individual, no longer a member of your tribe. You are a unit to be molded. The punishment for any infraction was swift and often brutal. Speaking native languages was among the most serious offenses. Children caught speaking their mother tongue faced a range of punishments that would be considered torture by today's standards. Some were beaten with leather straps or wooden paddles. Others were forced to stand for hours with their arms outstretched, holding heavy objects until their muscles screamed in agony. The dark basement or dungeon, present in many schools, became a place of particular terror. Children could be locked in these spaces for days with minimal food and water, sometimes chained to the walls. One particularly cruel punishment involved forcing children to kneel on marbles or beans for hours while reciting Christian prayers. The pain would become excruciating, but any movement would result in extended punishment. Some schools employed the hot line, where children were forced to stand with their toes on a painted line in the scorching sun for entire days without water. In winter, the punishment might involve being locked outside in thin clothing or being forced to take ice-cold baths. The schools also developed sophisticated systems of peer enforcement. Older students were recruited as officers, who monitored younger children and reported infractions. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and mistrust. Children learned they could trust no one, that even their fellow Indigenous students might betray them for small privileges or to avoid punishment themselves. Some schools implemented telltale systems where children were rewarded for informing on others who spoke native languages or practiced traditional customs in secret. Beyond physical punishment, the schools excelled at psychological torture. Children who cried for their parents were mocked and humiliated in front of their peers. Those who refused to abandon their cultural practices might be forced to watch as sacred objects were destroyed or desecrated. Letters from home, when they were allowed at all, were often censored or withheld as punishment. Some children went years without knowing if their parents were alive or dead. The labor system in boarding schools was perhaps one of the most exploitative aspects. Marketed as vocational training, children were essentially used as unpaid laborers to keep the institutions running. Boys as young as 6 might work in the fields for hours each day, maintaining the farms that fed the schools. They worked in dangerous conditions in workshops, laundries, and kitchens. Girls were trained exclusively for domestic service, cooking, cleaning, sewing, and childcare. The half-day system meant children spent only half their time in actual academic instruction. The rest was dedicated to labor. This work was not gentle vocational training. Children operated dangerous equipment without proper safety training. They worked in extreme weather conditions. Agricultural work was particularly brutal. Children picked crops in scorching heat, their hands bloodied from cotton bolls or corn husks. In the school laundries, girls worked with caustic chemicals that burned their skin, standing for hours in steamy rooms stirring heavy loads of wet clothing and linens. Food, despite the agricultural work done by students, was often scarce and of poor quality. While school promotional materials showed well-fed children, the reality was often near starvation rations. Children ate watery oatmeal, spoiled meat, and wormy bread. Many survivors recalled being constantly hungry, sneaking into kitchens to steal scraps or eating grass and leaves to fill their empty stomachs. Meanwhile, staff often ate completely different, far superior meals. The health conditions in these schools were abysmal. Overcrowding was common, with children packed into dormitories with poor ventilation. Tuberculosis, influenza, and other contagious diseases spread rapidly. The school's response to illness was often neglectful at best, cruel at worst. Sick children might be isolated in cold, bare infirmaries with minimal care. Those with contagious diseases were sometimes left to die rather than risk spreading illness to white staff members. Sexual abuse was another dark reality that many schools worked hard to cover up. Children were vulnerable to predation from staff members, older students, and even visiting officials. The strict gender segregation and repressive attitudes toward sexuality created environments where abuse could flourish unchecked. Children who reported abuse were often punished for lying or impurity. The trauma from these experiences would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the boarding school system was how it perverted the very concept of education. These children had come from cultures with rich educational traditions, complex oral histories, sophisticated ecological knowledge, intricate spiritual practices. All of this was dismissed as savage superstition. Instead, they were given a rudimentary education designed to prepare them only for menial labor. They were taught that everything about their heritage was shameful, backward, and wrong. Lucy Pretty Eagle was 5 years old when the agents came to the reservation. She remembered hiding behind her grandmother's skirts as the men in dark suits spoke with her parents in a language she didn't understand. Her older brother had been taken 2 years before and hadn't returned. Now they wanted her. Her mother wept as they pried Lucy from her arms, her father's face a mask of controlled rage and helplessness. As the wagon pulled away, Lucy watched her parents grow smaller, her mother running after them until she collapsed in the dust. It would be 8 years before Lucy saw her family again. At Chemawa Indian School in Oregon, Lucy became Lucy number 247. Her beautiful beaded dress, made by her grandmother for her naming ceremony, was stripped away and burned. The matron cut her hair while she sobbed, each snip destroying the careful braids her mother had woven that morning. When Lucy cried out in her native language calling for her mother, she received her first beating. The message was clear: that little girl, that language, that life was dead. The early days were the worst. Lucy couldn't understand what anyone was saying. When she failed to follow instructions given in English, she was punished for disobedience. Hunger became her constant companion. The thin gruel they served for breakfast couldn't fill the hollow ache in her stomach. She learned to save bits of bread in her pockets, even when they grew moldy, because anything was better than the gnawing emptiness. At night, in the crowded dormitory, Lucy could hear other children crying softly into their pillows. Some called out in their sleep for mothers who couldn't hear them. The older girls had learned to cry silently, their shoulders shaking in the dark. Anyone caught crying during the day faced humiliation. They might be forced to stand in front of the entire school while the staff mocked them for being weak little Indians. Lucy's days followed a crushing routine. Wake at 5 a.m. to the clanging bell. Stand at the foot of the bed for inspection. March to the washroom where they bathed in cold water even in winter. Don the rough uniform that scratched against her skin. March to chapel for morning prayers to a God she didn't understand, who apparently required her to abandon everything her family held sacred. Then breakfast, usually a watery porridge that tasted of nothing. School lessons were a torment of incomprehension. Lucy sat at hard wooden desks while teachers spoke rapidly in English about things that made no sense. When she couldn't answer questions, she was made to stand in the corner wearing a dunce cap. Other children who had been there longer would translate in whispers when the teacher wasn't looking, risking punishment to help newer arrivals. This secret network of mutual aid was one of the few things that made survival possible. But it was during work training that Lucy learned the true purpose of her education. At 6 years old, she was assigned to the laundry. The work was back-breaking, hauling heavy baskets of wet clothing, stirring steaming vats with paddles almost as tall as she was, pressing sheets with irons that burned her small hands when she wasn't careful. This wasn't training for anything except a life of servitude. The turning point came when Lucy was 7. She had been caught speaking her language to another girl from her tribe. The punishment was severe: 3 days in the dark basement with only bread and water. But in that darkness, something hardened inside her. They could beat her body, but she would not let them kill her spirit. She began to practice her language in secret, teaching it to younger children in whispers during work assignments. It became an act of resistance, a way to stay alive inside. Disease struck the school regularly, and Lucy watched as children disappeared into the infirmary, never to return. When scarlet fever swept through the dormitories, Lucy fell ill. For days she drifted in and out of consciousness, dreaming of home, of her mother's cool hands on her fevered forehead. She survived when many didn't, but the experience left her with damaged hearing that would plague her for life. As Lucy grew older, she became one of the big girls who tried to protect the younger ones. She would slip them extra food when she could, comfort them after punishments, and teach them the survival skills she had learned. When new children arrived, terrified and confused, Lucy would whisper to them in whatever native language she could manage: "Be strong. Stay alive. Remember who you are." The sexual predation in the school was an open secret. Lucy learned to avoid being alone with certain staff members, to never walk down empty corridors, to always stay in groups. When the new minister arrived and began showing special interest in the older girls, Lucy organized a system where girls would protect each other, creating alibis and distractions. Not everyone could be saved, but they tried. Letters from home were rare and heavily censored. When Lucy finally received word that her grandmother had died, the news was months old. She wasn't allowed to return for the funeral, wasn't allowed to mourn in the traditional way. Instead, she was told to pray for her heathen soul, and be grateful she herself had been saved from such darkness. That night, Lucy and several other girls snuck out to the woods and held their own ceremony, risking severe punishment to honor their dead in the proper way. By the time Lucy was 13, she had been at Chemawa for 8 years. She had survived beatings, illness, starvation, and countless attempts to destroy her spirit. When she was finally allowed to visit home, she discovered the full extent of what had been stolen from her. She could barely speak her language. Traditional foods tasted strange to her. She felt caught between two worlds, no longer fully at home in either. Her parents had aged decades in 8 years. Her mother's hair had gone gray, her father moved like an old man. They had lost 2 other children to boarding schools, one to disease, one to suicide. The family she returned to was broken, scattered, struggling to survive on a reservation where traditional ways of life had been systematically destroyed. But Lucy also brought something back with her, a fierce determination that what happened to her would not happen to the next generation. She had survived their attempts to kill the Indian within her, and she would make sure others survived too. Her story was one of thousands, each a testament to both the cruelty humans could inflict and the resilience of the human spirit to endure. The numbers are staggering, though the true count may never be known. Between 1869 and the 1970s, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of Native American children passed through the boarding school system. At its peak in 1926, nearly 83% of Indigenous school-age children were attending boarding schools rather than community day schools. Some estimates suggest that by the 1970s, when the worst of the system finally began to crumble, as many as 1 in 3 Native American children had been separated from their families and forced into these institutions. But these statistics only tell part of the story. Behind each number was a child ripped from their home, a family torn apart, a community losing its future. The government kept meticulous records of enrollment and attendance, but far less documentation exists about the children who never made it home. Recent investigations have begun uncovering the unmarked graves at former school sites. Thousands of children whose deaths were recorded only as line items in administrative reports, if at all. The geographic scope of this system was breathtaking. By 1900, there were 147 federal boarding schools operating across 25 states. Add to this approximately 200 mission schools run by various Christian denominations with government contracts, and the network becomes even more extensive. From Carlisle in Pennsylvania to Sherman Institute in California, from Haskell in Kansas to Phoenix Indian School in Arizona, these institutions formed a vast archipelago of cultural destruction that touched virtually every indigenous community in the United States. The schools were strategically located far from reservations, making it nearly impossible for parents to visit their children. This geographic isolation was intentional. The harder it was for families to maintain contact, the more complete the separation from tribal influence. Some children were sent thousands of miles from home. Apache children from Arizona might find themselves in Pennsylvania. Lakota children from South Dakota could end up in Oregon. This scattering was designed to prevent children from the same tribes from clustering together and maintaining their languages and customs. The system operated with military efficiency. Each year, agents would arrive at reservations with quotas to fill. They maintained lists of school-age children and would go house to house collecting them. Some agents offered inducements, promises of food, clothing, and education. Others simply took children by force. Resistance was met with harsh consequences. Parents who hid their children could be imprisoned or have their government rations withheld. On some reservations, Indian police, themselves products of the assimilation system, were used to round up children. The schools were categorized into different types, each serving the system's broader goals. On-reservation boarding schools were considered the first step, taking younger children who could still return home occasionally. Off-reservation boarding schools were for older children and operated on the principle of complete separation from tribal influence. Industrial schools focused on vocational training, preparing students for lives as manual laborers and domestic servants. Each type of institution played its role in the larger machine of cultural genocide. Funding for this system came from multiple sources, creating a web of financial incentives that perpetuated the abuse. The federal government provided base funding, but schools were expected to be largely self-sufficient. This led to the extensive use of child labor disguised as vocational training. Schools operated farms, dairies, and workshops where children provided free labor. Products made by students were sold commercially, with profits going to school operations rather than the children who made them. Religious organizations received government contracts to operate schools, creating a profitable partnership between church and state. Different denominations competed for contracts and students, as more students meant more funding. This financial incentive structure meant that keeping enrollment numbers high was more important than student welfare. Children who ran away were hunted down and returned not just for ideological reasons, but because each child represented funding that the school couldn't afford to lose. The health statistics from boarding schools reveal the devastating human cost of this system. Death rates at some schools exceeded 10% annually, a staggering figure that would be considered a humanitarian crisis by any standard. Tuberculosis was rampant in overcrowded dormitories. Trachoma, an infectious eye disease, left many children partially or fully blind. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making children vulnerable to every passing illness. When children died, schools often didn't notify parents for months, if at all. Bodies were buried in school cemeteries, often in unmarked graves. Parents might receive a terse letter stating their child had gone to heaven, with no explanation of how they died or where they were buried. Some families never learned what happened to their children. The administrative records that survived show a callous indifference to these deaths, children reduced to statistics in mortality reports. The psychological damage inflicted by the boarding school system affected entire communities. When children returned home after years away, they often couldn't communicate with their own families. Languages were lost in a single generation. Traditional knowledge about medicines, ceremonies, and survival skills disappeared. The boarding schools created what researchers now call historical trauma, psychological and emotional wounds passed down through generations. Many children emerged from boarding schools unable to function in either native or white society. They had been taught to be ashamed of their heritage but would never be accepted as equals in white society. They were trained for menial jobs in an economy that was rapidly industrializing beyond the skills they'd learned. This lost generation struggled with identity, belonging, and purpose in ways that would ripple through their families for generations. The scale of cultural destruction was systematic and deliberate. Government documents from the era reveal that officials understood exactly what they were doing. Commissioner of Indian Affairs Thomas Jefferson Morgan wrote in 1889 that the goal was nothing less than the complete destruction of native languages and cultures within a single generation. This wasn't a side effect of misguided education policy, it was the explicit purpose. By the 1920s, the boarding school system had become self-perpetuating. Many staff members were themselves products of boarding schools, perpetuating the cycle of abuse they had experienced. Some had internalized the messages of cultural inferiority so completely that they became the harshest enforcers of assimilation policies. This created a particularly painful dynamic where indigenous people became instruments of their own cultural destruction. The true scale of this tragedy is still being uncovered. As more schools are investigated, more unmarked graves discovered, more survivor testimonies recorded, the magnitude of what was done becomes clearer. This wasn't just education policy, it was a systematic attempt to destroy entire cultures, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency and justified with racist ideology. The fact that it continued for over a century, affecting hundreds of thousands of children, makes it one of the longest-running human rights abuses in American history. Richard Henry Pratt stands as the architect of cultural genocide, though he would have been offended by such a characterization. In his mind, he was a humanitarian, a progressive reformer saving indigenous children from what he saw as the inevitable extinction of their race. His famous motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," revealed both his racist assumptions and his messianic complex. Pratt genuinely believed he was doing God's work, which perhaps made him more dangerous than those who acted from simple cruelty. Pratt's background as a military officer shaped his approach to education. He had served in the Indian Wars, leading the 10th Cavalry Regiment of African American soldiers known as Buffalo Soldiers. His experience controlling and civilizing both black soldiers and native prisoners of war convinced him that military discipline could transform anyone into a productive citizen. At Fort Marion in Florida, he experimented on native prisoners, forcing them to cut their hair, wear military uniforms and learn English. When some of these men later became interpreters and scouts for the Army, Pratt saw it as proof his methods worked. His personality was that of an absolute authoritarian who brooked no dissent. Former students and staff described him as a man who demanded total obedience and viewed any questioning of his methods as betrayal. He regularly gave speeches comparing native children to blank slates that needed to be written upon by civilized hands. In his writings he revealed a deep disgust for native cultures, describing traditional practices as savage, filthy, and degraded. Yet he positioned himself as the friend of the Indian, the only one who truly understood how to save them. But Pratt was far from alone in perpetrating this system. Estelle Real, who served as superintendent of Indian schools from 1898 to 1910, was perhaps even more influential in systematizing the abuse. Unlike Pratt's military approach, Real couched her policies in the language of maternal care and Christian duty. She developed the course of study for Indian schools, that standardized curriculum across all boarding schools, ensuring that whether a child was in Alaska or Arizona, they would receive the same program of cultural erasure. Real's approach was insidiously effective because she understood how to market cultural genocide as kindness. She organized publicity campaigns showing before and after photos of native children, wild savages transformed into neat Christian citizens. She wrote extensively about the need to mother these poor unfortunate children into civilization. Her writings reveal a woman who genuinely believed she was saving children while systematically destroying their identities. She pioneered many of the psychological manipulation techniques that would become standard in boarding schools. The staff who worked directly with children often fell into several categories. Some were sadists who enjoyed the power they wielded over helpless children. These were the ones who devised creative punishments, who took pleasure in breaking children's spirits. They were often people who had failed in other careers and found in the boarding schools a place where their cruelty could be disguised as discipline. Others were true believers in the civilizing mission. Many were missionaries or deeply religious individuals who saw themselves as saving heathen souls. These could be even more dangerous than the overtly cruel because they performed their abuse with clear consciences. They could beat a child for speaking their native language and then kneel beside them to pray for their salvation. Their combination of violence and self-righteousness created a particularly toxic environment where children learned that love and pain were inseparable. Then there were the bureaucrats, administrators who perhaps started with good intentions but became cogs in the machine. They filed reports, managed budgets, and processed children like inventory. Commissioner of Indian Affairs Francis Loop, who served from 1905 to 1909, exemplified this type. His annual reports discussed children in terms of industrial output and cost per unit, reducing human beings to line items in federal budgets. He pushed for greater efficiency in the schools, which translated to more work extracted from children at lower cost. The matrons who oversaw the girls' dormitories occupied a unique position in the hierarchy of abuse. Many were single women who had few other career options in that era. Some had themselves experienced abuse and perpetuated those patterns. Others were failed motherly figures who oscillated between smothering affection and cruel punishment. Survivor accounts describe matrons who would comfort a crying child one moment and beat them for weakness the next. Among the most troubling figures were the indigenous staff members who had themselves been products of the boarding school system. People like Carlos Montezuma, an Apache doctor who initially supported the boarding school system before eventually becoming one of its critics, embodied the complex psychology of internalized oppression. Some became harsh disciplinarians, having absorbed the message that their own cultures were inferior. They often treated students more harshly than white staff, as if trying to beat out of the children what had been beaten out of them. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was how normal, seemingly decent people became participants in systematic abuse. Teachers who might have been kind to white children showed no compassion to native students. Cooks who had children of their own at home served spoiled food to indigenous children without a second thought. Maintenance workers repaired the isolation cells where children were tortured. Bus drivers delivered new victims to the schools. An entire infrastructure of ordinary people enabled extraordinary cruelty. The sexual predators within the system operated with near impunity. These included priests, teachers, older students, and maintenance staff who recognized the vulnerability of children separated from any protection. The strict gender segregation and repressive sexual attitudes of the schools created environments where abuse flourished in silence. Predators knew that children who reported abuse would likely be punished for lying or impurity, creating a perfect hunting ground for those inclined to such evil. Government inspectors who were supposed to provide oversight often became enablers of the system. They would announce their visits in advance, allowing schools to temporarily improve conditions. They interviewed children in the presence of staff, ensuring no one would speak truthfully about abuse. Their reports glossed over deaths, minimized abuse, and praised the progress being made in civilizing native children. Many inspectors were political appointees more interested in maintaining the system than protecting children. The medical staff at boarding schools occupied a particularly dark corner of this system. Doctors who took oaths to do no harm presided over institutions where children died from preventable diseases. Some conducted medical experiments on native children, testing tuberculosis treatments or nutritional theories. They signed death certificates that listed natural causes for children who died from neglect and abuse. Nurses who should have been caregivers often became enforcers of the school's harsh regimens. What united all these individuals was their participation in a system that dehumanized indigenous children. Whether through active cruelty, ideological fervor, or passive complicity, they all contributed to cultural genocide. Some later expressed regret. Pratt himself eventually criticized the boarding school system he created, though more for its failure to fully assimilate native peoples than for its cruelty. But most went to their graves believing they had done good work, civilizing the savage, saving the heathen. This ability to commit atrocities while maintaining a sense of moral superiority remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the boarding school system. The architects and enforcers of this system left behind extensive writings that reveal their mindsets. They genuinely believed indigenous peoples were inferior, that native cultures were dying anyway, and that forced assimilation was an act of mercy. This combination of racism, paternalism, and self-righteousness created individuals capable of tremendous cruelty while believing themselves to be saviors. Understanding their psychology helps us recognize how ordinary people can become instruments of systematic evil when given ideological justification and institutional power. The society that allowed the boarding school system to flourish for over a century was one deeply infected with racist ideology and manifest destiny. This wasn't a secret program hidden from public view. It was celebrated in newspapers, funded by Congress, and supported by mainstream churches. The American public not only knew what was happening but actively participated in creating and maintaining a system of cultural genocide. The intellectual framework that justified these schools emerged from the confluence of scientific racism, social Darwinism, and Christian supremacy that dominated late 19th century American thought. Anthropologists and scientists of the era ranked races on hierarchical scales, always placing white Europeans at the top and indigenous peoples near the bottom. These weren't fringe theories, they were taught at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Respected scholars published papers arguing that Native Americans were biologically incapable of civilization without forced intervention. Popular literature and media reinforced these ideas. Newspapers regularly published stories about savage Indians being transformed into productive citizens through boarding schools. Before and after photographs became a popular form of propaganda, wild-haired children in traditional dress contrasted with the same children shorn and uniformed. These images were displayed at world's fairs and exhibitions as proof of American progress and benevolence. Visitors would marvel at how effectively the schools were killing the Indian and saving the man. Churches played a particularly crucial role in normalizing the boarding school system. Every major Christian denomination operated schools or supported the government's efforts. Sermons across the country portrayed the education of Native children as Christian duty. Missionary societies raised funds by showing stereoscopic images of heathen children being saved through Christian education. Church members donated money, supplies, and even volunteered at the schools, seeing their participation as holy work. The Women's National Indian Association, founded in 1879, exemplified how progressive reform movements became vehicles for cultural destruction. These were educated, middle-class white women who considered themselves advocates for Native peoples. They lobbied for boarding schools, raised funds, and visited institutions to ensure children were being properly civilized. Their writings reveal a toxic mixture of maternal condescension and cultural supremacy. They spoke of Native children as our little brown brothers and sisters, who needed to be saved from their degraded families. Local communities near boarding schools became economically dependent on them. Schools were major employers, hiring teachers, matrons, cooks, maintenance workers, and guards from nearby towns. Local businesses profited from contracts to supply food, clothing, and materials. When reformers occasionally questioned the school's methods, local chambers of commerce and business leaders lobbied to keep them open. The economic incentives created a powerful constituency for maintaining the status quo. The legal system provided no protection for Native families. The Supreme Court's 1823 decision in Johnson v. McIntosh had established the doctrine of discovery, essentially declaring that indigenous peoples had no true land rights. Subsequent decisions stripped Native peoples of most legal protections. Parents who resisted having their children taken could be imprisoned without trial. Traditional spiritual practices were outlawed, making it illegal for families to pass on their cultures even if they managed to keep their children home. State governments competed to host federal boarding schools, seeing them as sources of federal funding and prestige. Politicians boasted about securing schools for their districts. State legislatures passed laws supporting the removal of Native children and criminalizing traditional practices. Local law enforcement helped round up children and hunt down runaways. The entire apparatus of government, from federal to local levels, participated in enforcing cultural genocide. The medical and scientific communities provided intellectual cover for the abuse. Doctors published studies claiming that Native children's brains were underdeveloped and required the stimulus of civilization to properly form. Nutritionists argued that traditional Native diets were causing mental and physical degeneration, justifying the meager and often spoiled food provided at schools. Psychologists developed theories about the Indian mind that portrayed Native peoples as childlike and requiring strict discipline to develop properly. Universities trained the teachers and administrators who staffed boarding schools. Teaching colleges included courses on Indian education that instructed future educators on how to break down tribal identity. Academic conferences featured presentations on the most effective methods of forced assimilation. Scholarly journals published articles celebrating successful transformations of savage children into civilized citizens. The entire educational establishment participated in creating and refining methods of cultural destruction. Even reformers who criticized the boarding school's worst abuses often supported their fundamental mission. The influential Miriam Report of 1928, which documented horrific conditions in the schools, still endorsed the goal of assimilation. It criticized methods but not purposes, arguing for more humane ways to achieve the same end, the erasure of native identity. This limited reform vision meant that even when changes were made, the essential structure of cultural genocide remained intact. The press played a crucial role in maintaining public support. Major newspapers published glowing accounts of boarding school graduations, featuring stories of successful students who had abandoned their savage ways. When occasional scandals emerged, such as reports of deaths or abuse, newspapers typically portrayed them as isolated incidents in otherwise beneficial institutions. Editorial writers argued that whatever suffering occurred was necessary for the greater good of civilizing the Indian race. Professional organizations provided additional legitimacy. The National Education Association endorsed the boarding school system and hosted conferences on Indian education. Social workers praised the schools for rescuing children from poverty and paganism. Even some early anthropologists who studied native cultures supported boarding schools as necessary for native peoples to survive in the modern world. Their professional approval gave scientific veneer to cultural destruction. The entertainment industry commodified and trivialized native suffering. Wild West shows featured reformed Indians who had been educated at boarding schools, presenting them as curiosities for white audiences. Postcards depicting boarding school children were sold as souvenirs. Photography studios near schools did brisk business taking portraits of native children in their before state and then in their civilized appearance, selling these transformation images to a public hungry for proof of American superiority. Perhaps most disturbing was how the system created its own justification. As boarding schools destroyed native languages and cultures, officials pointed to the loss as evidence that these cultures were dying naturally and that assimilation was necessary for survival. They created the conditions that necessitated their proposed solution. Communities weakened by having their children stolen were then criticized for being unable to properly care for their remaining children, justifying taking even more. The bystander effect operated on a massive scale. Millions of Americans knew about boarding schools but assumed that if the government and churches supported them, they must be beneficial. Those who might have had doubts comforted themselves with the belief that educated Indians would be better off than wild ones. The systematic nature of the program, its official sanction, widespread support, and long duration, made it seem normal, even necessary. This societal complicity extended to native peoples who had internalized colonial messages. Some native leaders, educated in boarding schools themselves, advocated for the system as the only way for their people to survive. They had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they saw their own cultures as inferior and boarding schools as salvation. This internalized oppression created divisions within native communities that weakened resistance to the schools. By making cultural genocide appear civilized, rational, and even benevolent, American society created a system that could operate in plain sight for over a century. The boarding schools weren't hidden away. They were featured in government reports, celebrated in churches, and supported by mainstream society. This normalization of atrocity, this ability to commit systematic abuse while maintaining a sense of moral superiority, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of American history. It reveals how an entire society can participate in evil while believing itself to be doing good. The first cracks in the boarding school system appeared not from external pressure but from the courage of its survivors. In the 1920s, a new generation of Native Americans who had been educated in these very institutions began using the tools of literacy and law against their oppressors. They had learned English, understood American legal systems, and could navigate white society, but instead of assimilating, they became fierce advocates for their people. One of the most significant early voices was Gertrude Bonin, known as Zit-Kalasa, a Yankton, Dakota woman who had attended White's Manual Labor Institute and later taught at Carlisle. Her writings, published in magazines like Atlantic Monthly and Harper's, gave white Americans their first glimpse into the reality of boarding school life from a Native perspective. She wrote of the iron routine that crushed children's spirits, the civilizing machine that ground away at Indigenous identity. Her words were carefully crafted to appeal to white sensibilities while delivering a devastating critique of the system that had tried to destroy her. The Society of American Indians, founded in 1911, became a platform for boarding school survivors to organize resistance. Members like Charles Eastman, Carlos Montezuma, and Laura Cornelius Kellogg, all products of the boarding school system, used their education to fight for Native rights. They exposed abuses, lobbied Congress, and perhaps most importantly, provided living proof that education didn't require cultural annihilation. Their very existence challenged the fundamental premise of the boarding schools. By the late 1920s, conditions in some schools had become so horrific that even government officials couldn't ignore them. The Merriam Report of 1928, commissioned by the Secretary of the Interior, documented conditions that shocked even those who supported assimilation. Investigators found children dying from preventable diseases, working in dangerous conditions, and suffering from severe malnutrition. The report's dry bureaucratic language couldn't hide the horror. Children as young as 5 working full days, food budgets of 11 cents per child per day, dormitories so overcrowded that tuberculosis spread like wildfire. John Collier's appointment as Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1933 marked a significant shift. Collier, influenced by progressive reformers and Native advocates, began implementing what he called the Indian New Deal. He encouraged day schools over boarding schools, promoted the teaching of Native languages and cultures, and attempted to give tribes more control over their children's education. His reforms faced fierce resistance from boarding school administrators, missionaries, and members of Congress who saw any acknowledgement of Native culture as a step backward. But the most powerful force for change came from Native parents and communities who never stopped fighting for their children. Throughout the boarding school era, parents had resisted in ways large and small. Some hid their children in remote areas when school agents came. Others sent their children to relatives in different states or even Mexico to avoid capture. Parents organized petitions, hired lawyers when they could afford them, and traveled hundreds of miles to visit their children despite school policies designed to prevent contact. The World War II era brought unexpected allies to the cause. Native Americans served in the military at higher rates than any other ethnic group, with many boarding school alumni among them. Their service, particularly that of the code talkers who used Native languages to create unbreakable codes, highlighted the irony of a system that tried to destroy the very languages that helped win the war. Veterans returned home with new legal knowledge, organizational skills, and a determination that their children wouldn't suffer as they had. The 1950s saw the rise of Native advocacy organizations that specifically targeted boarding schools. The National Congress of American Indians, founded in 1944, made education reform a priority. They documented abuses, provided legal assistance to families, and lobbied for change. Native women like Annie Waneka, who had attended boarding school herself, became powerful advocates, using their experiences to push for reform. They understood the system from the inside and knew exactly where to apply pressure. Legal challenges began to chip away at the boarding school system's foundation. Native lawyers, many educated in the very institutions they now fought against, filed suits challenging forced attendance, religious suppression, and physical abuse. While many cases were dismissed or settled quietly, each legal challenge weakened the system's legitimacy and emboldened more families to resist. The civil rights movement of the 1960s provided a new framework for resistance. Native activists connected their struggle to the broader fight for human rights, gaining allies and media attention. The American Indian movement, founded in 1968, made boarding schools a central focus of their activism. They organized protests at schools, helped parents reclaim their children, and brought national attention to ongoing abuses. Perhaps the most powerful form of resistance was the persistence of Native cultures despite decades of suppression. In secret ceremonies held in school basements, in languages whispered between children after lights out, in traditional songs hummed during work assignments, Indigenous identities survived. Elders who had hidden traditional knowledge began teaching again. Communities that had seemed broken began to rebuild. The very survival of Native cultures after a century of systematic assault was itself an act of resistance. The 1960s also saw non-Native allies beginning to question the boarding school system. Anthropologists, social workers, and educators who had once supported assimilation began documenting its failures. Churches that had operated schools began facing pressure from their own members to acknowledge the harm they had caused. Media coverage shifted from celebrating transformation to exposing abuse. Student resistance within the schools became more organized and effective. In the 1960s and early 1970s, strikes and protests erupted at boarding schools across the country. Students demanded better food, an end to physical punishment, and the right to speak their languages. At some schools, students took over buildings or organized mass escapes. The image of Native children as passive victims was shattered by young people who fought back with courage and determination. The Kennedy Report of 1969, officially titled Indian Education, A National Tragedy, A National Challenge, delivered another devastating assessment of the boarding school system. It found that Native students had the highest dropout rates and lowest achievement levels of any ethnic group, direct results of culturally destructive education policies. The report recommended fundamental changes, including community control of schools and culturally relevant curricula. By the early 1970s, the combination of Native resistance, legal challenges, shifting public opinion, and government reports had created unstoppable momentum for change. The Indian Education Act of 1972 and the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 gave tribes more control over their children's education. While some boarding schools continued to operate, they were transformed from instruments of cultural destruction to institutions that, at least in theory, respected Native identity. The turning point hadn't come from a single dramatic event but from decades of resistance by countless individuals who refused to let their cultures die. Parents who fought for their children, students who preserved their languages in secret, graduates who used their education to fight the system, and communities that never gave up hope. Together, they achieved what had once seemed impossible. They broke the boarding school system's grip on Native children and began the long process of healing and cultural revitalization. When the boarding school system finally began to crumble in the 1970s, what remained was a landscape of trauma that stretched across generations. The immediate aftermath revealed horrors that even critics of the system hadn't fully grasped. As schools closed or transformed, maintenance workers discovered hidden graves, punishment cells with children's scratch marks on the walls, and records that documented decades of abuse in bureaucratic detail. At Carlisle, which had closed in 1918, Army personnel returning the property to military use found the cemetery where hundreds of children lay buried, many in unmarked graves. Parents who had spent decades wondering what happened to their children learned that they had died alone, far from home, buried without ceremony or notification. The task of identifying remains and returning them to tribal lands, a process that continues today, became a painful journey of collective mourning and long-delayed grief. The true scale of death became clearer as researchers began examining school records. At some institutions, mortality rates had exceeded those of American soldiers in World War I. Children had died from tuberculosis, influenza, malnutrition, accidents during dangerous work assignments, suicide, and sometimes simply broken hearts. The medical term used when children seem to will themselves to die rather than endure more suffering. Each death represented not just a lost life but a family destroyed, a lineage ended, a carrier of cultural knowledge gone forever. Survivors emerged from the schools carrying wounds that weren't always visible. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and panic attacks triggered by sounds, smells, or situations that reminded them of school. The sound of a bell could send a grown man into a cold sweat. The smell of industrial soap could make a woman vomit. These survivors had learned to hide their reactions, adding another layer of suffering to their trauma. The damage to family structures was catastrophic. Children who had been taken at age 4 or 5 and kept away for a decade or more returned as strangers to their own families. They couldn't speak their parents' language. They had been taught to be ashamed of their family's ways of life. Parents who had fought to maintain traditional practices found their own children looking at them with disgust or pity. The schools had successfully driven wedges between generations, creating conflicts that tore families apart. Many survivors found themselves caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. They had been trained for jobs that didn't exist on reservations, domestic service and agricultural labor in an increasingly industrialized economy. The industrial training they received was often decades out of date. Young women trained to be Victorian-era domestic servants found those skills useless. Young men trained in obsolete farming techniques couldn't support families. The promise of education preparing them for success in white society proved to be another lie. The sexual abuse that had been rampant in the schools left particularly deep scars. Survivors often couldn't speak about what had been done to them, carrying shame that wasn't theirs to bear. Many developed substance abuse problems trying to numb memories. Some continued cycles of abuse, having learned that power meant the ability to hurt others. Others withdrew entirely from intimate relationships, unable to trust or be vulnerable. The ripple effects of this abuse would impact families for generations. When the scope of abuse began to be documented in the 1970s and 1980s, The response from institutions was often denial and minimization. Churches that had operated schools claimed that any abuse was the work of a few bad individuals, not systematic policy. Government officials pointed to good intentions and the different standards of past eras. Some schools destroyed records rather than allow them to be examined. The same institutions that had documented every aspect of cultural destruction suddenly claimed to have no knowledge of abuse. Legal battles for justice faced enormous obstacles. Statutes of limitations had expired for most criminal cases. Government immunity protected federal schools from many lawsuits. Churches claimed religious freedom protections. Many survivors were reluctant to testify, not wanting to relive trauma or face disbelief. When cases did go forward, survivors faced defense attorneys who questioned their memories, suggested they were exaggerating, or argued that corporal punishment was normal for the era. The few successful lawsuits resulted in monetary settlements that could never truly compensate for what was lost. How do you put a price on a stolen childhood, a lost language, a severed connection to ancestors? Some survivors rejected settlements, saying they wanted acknowledgement and apology, not money. Others took settlements out of desperate need, then felt guilty for selling their suffering. The legal system, designed for property disputes and personal injuries, proved inadequate for addressing cultural genocide. Attempts to document what happened faced resistance from unexpected sources. Some Native communities, overwhelmed by collective trauma, didn't want to dig up painful memories. Survivors who had spent decades trying to forget were asked to remember and testify. Families were divided between those who wanted truth exposed and those who wanted to move forward. The process of seeking justice often created new wounds alongside old ones. The psychological impact on subsequent generations, what researchers now call intergenerational trauma, became increasingly apparent. Children of boarding school survivors often struggled with depression, anxiety, and identity issues even though they hadn't attended the schools themselves. Parents who had never learned how to be parents because they were raised in institutions struggled to show affection or maintain stable families. The schools had damaged not just individuals but the transmission of parenting knowledge across generations. Community healing efforts faced enormous challenges. Traditional healing practices that might have helped had been suppressed or lost. Many survivors had been taught that traditional spirituality was evil and struggled to reconnect with ceremonies that could have provided comfort. Elders who retained traditional knowledge were dying, and the generation that should have been learning from them had been locked away in schools. Communities had to rebuild healing traditions while dealing with ongoing trauma. The economic impact of the boarding school system continued long after schools closed. Generations of Native people had been denied real education while being used as unpaid labor. Instead of doctors, lawyers, engineers, and teachers, the schools had produced manual laborers and domestic workers, when they produced functional adults at all. The economic disadvantage created by substandard education compounded existing poverty on reservations. Communities that should have been developing professional classes were instead dealing with widespread dysfunction. Mental health and substance abuse problems reached epidemic proportions in many Native communities, direct results of boarding school trauma. Suicide rates among Native youth skyrocketed. Alcoholism, introduced and encouraged in some boarding schools as a way to control students, destroyed families and communities. The violence that children had experienced and witnessed often continued in domestic abuse. Social workers and health professionals, mostly non-Native, rarely understood the historical roots of these problems and often applied solutions that echoed boarding school paternalism. As the 1980s and 1990s progressed, a truth and reconciliation movement began to emerge. Survivors started speaking publicly about their experiences, breaking decades of silence. Churches began issuing apologies, though many survivors found them insufficient and self-serving. The Canadian government's acknowledgement of its residential school system put pressure on the United States to confront its own history. But official acknowledgement came slowly and grudgingly. The process of exhuming graves at former school sites became a flashpoint for long-buried grief and anger. Each discovered grave represented a child whose family had never known their fate. Advances in DNA testing offered hope of identifying remains, but also required survivors and descendants to relive trauma. Repatriation ceremonies, returning children's remains to their homelands, became powerful moments of collective mourning and cultural reclamation. By the early 2000s, the full impact of the boarding school system was undeniable. Multiple generations bore its scars. Entire languages had been lost. Traditional knowledge systems had been disrupted. Family structures had been shattered. The schools had succeeded in their goal of killing the Indian in many ways, but they had failed in their promise to save the man. Instead, they had created generations of wounded people struggling to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The legacy of Native American boarding schools extends far beyond historical documentation. It lives in the DNA of contemporary Indigenous communities, in the struggles of modern Native families, and in ongoing battles for cultural survival and recognition. Today, researchers understand that trauma can actually alter genetic expression, passing the biological impacts of suffering through generations. The boarding school system didn't just damage those who attended, it literally rewrote the genetic heritage of Native peoples. Modern archaeological technology has revealed truths that were hidden for decades. Ground-penetrating radar at former school sites continues to discover unmarked graves, children whose deaths were recorded only as statistics, if at all. Each discovery triggers fresh waves of grief in communities still processing historical trauma. In 2021, the remains of children who died at Carlisle over a century ago were still being identified and returned to their tribes. These repatriations become powerful ceremonies of healing, but also reminders of losses that can never be fully recovered. The destruction of native languages represents one of the boarding school's most lasting impacts. Of the estimated 300 indigenous languages spoken in what is now the United States before colonization, fewer than 200 remain, and most of these are critically endangered. Languages that encoded thousands of years of ecological knowledge, spiritual understanding, and cultural wisdom were silenced in a single generation. Linguists estimate that a native language dies every 2 weeks, taking with it irreplaceable ways of understanding the world. Contemporary efforts to revitalize languages face enormous challenges. Many languages have only a handful of elderly speakers remaining. Children must learn ancestral languages as foreign tongues rather than mother tongues absorbed naturally. The boarding schools created a break in transmission that no amount of classroom instruction can fully repair. Yet communities persist, developing immersion schools, language apps, and master apprentice programs. Every word recovered is an act of resistance against the boarding school legacy. The psychological patterns established in boarding schools continue to manifest in Native communities. Therapists working with Indigenous clients recognize boarding school syndrome, a cluster of symptoms including depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and difficulty with emotional intimacy. Many clients report feeling split between Native and white worlds, never fully belonging to either. The shame instilled by boarding schools, shame about being Native, speaking Native languages, practicing Native spirituality, passes from parent to child like a toxic inheritance. Modern research has documented how boarding school trauma affects parenting patterns. Survivors who were raised without parental affection in institutional settings often struggle to show physical affection to their own children. Those who were beaten for showing emotion may raise children in emotional silence. The authoritarian discipline of boarding schools gets replicated in homes where parents know no other model. Breaking these cycles requires conscious effort and often professional help that many Native communities lack access to. The economic devastation caused by substandard boarding school education continues to impact Native communities. Reservations have unemployment rates that would constitute national emergencies if they occurred in white communities. The vocational training that prepared students for obsolete jobs left generations without marketable skills. The disruption of traditional economic systems, hunting, fishing, gathering, trading, wasn't replaced with viable alternatives. Poverty becomes both a result of historical trauma and a barrier to healing from it. In education, the boarding school legacy creates ongoing challenges. Many Native parents, traumatized by their own educational experiences, struggle to engage with their children's schools. Teachers report that Native students often exhibit extreme anxiety around authority figures, hypervigilance in classroom settings, and reluctance to speak up, all behaviors that would have been survival mechanisms in boarding schools. The achievement gap between Native and non-Native students reflects not inability but the lasting impact of education weaponized against Indigenous peoples. Modern Native youth suicide rates, among the highest of any ethnic group in the United States, directly connect to boarding school trauma. Young people who never attended boarding schools nevertheless carry its weight. They inherit trauma responses, family dysfunction, and cultural disconnection without understanding their origins. The loss of traditional coming-of-age ceremonies, disrupted by boarding schools, leaves youth without clear paths to adulthood. Too many choose death over navigating a world that seems to offer no place for them. The foster care system continues patterns established by boarding schools. Native children are removed from their families at rates far exceeding other populations, often placed with non-Native families who know nothing of their cultures. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 attempted to address this, but Native children still enter foster care at rates 2.7 times higher than white children. Each removal echoes the boarding school era, perpetuating cycles of family disruption and cultural loss. Contemporary discoveries about boarding schools regularly make headlines, forcing America to confront this history. In 2021, the discovery of 215 unmarked graves at a former residential school in Canada sparked searches at American sites. Each discovery generates brief public attention before fading from mainstream consciousness. For Native communities, however, these aren't news cycles but ongoing reckonings with unhealed wounds. The Catholic Church and various Protestant denominations have issued apologies for their roles in operating boarding schools, but these often ring hollow to survivors. Apologies that don't include full disclosure of records, financial reparations, or fundamental changes in how churches interact with Native peoples feel like public relations exercises rather than genuine accountability. Some denominations have initiated reconciliation processes, but trust broken over centuries isn't easily rebuilt. Government acknowledgement has been even slower. Not until 2009 did the United States officially apologize for boarding schools, and this apology was buried in a defense appropriations bill, never spoken aloud by the president or given the public attention it deserved. The Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, launched in 2021, represents the first comprehensive attempt to document the full scope of the boarding school system, coming over 50 years after the worst schools closed. Modern parallels to boarding school policies appear in contemporary efforts to undermine Native sovereignty and culture. English-only education movements echo boarding school language suppression. Attempts to terminate tribal recognition recall efforts to destroy Native identity. Child welfare policies that prioritize non-Native placement continue patterns of family disruption. History doesn't repeat exactly, but its patterns persist in new forms. The resilience of Native peoples in the face of boarding school trauma represents one of the great untold stories of American history. Communities that should have been destroyed survived. Languages that were supposed to die are being revitalized. Spiritual practices that were outlawed are being reclaimed. Young Native people are earning advanced degrees, creating art, writing books, making films that tell their own stories rather than having them told by others. Healing movements within Native communities draw on both traditional and contemporary approaches. Ceremonies that were hidden for generations are being practiced openly. Healing circles address trauma collectively rather than individually. Traditional medicines work alongside modern therapy. Elders who survived boarding schools share their stories, transforming personal pain into collective wisdom. Each act of healing reverberates through families and communities. The warning for contemporary society couldn't be clearer. The boarding school system shows how education can become a weapon, how child welfare can mask child abuse, how good intentions can enable genocide. It demonstrates the danger of believing one culture superior to others, of using children as instruments of social engineering, of dismissing family bonds as obstacles to progress. These lessons matter urgently in a world still grappling with cultural supremacy and systemic racism. For non-Native Americans, the boarding school legacy demands recognition of how their prosperity was built on Indigenous suffering. The land-grant universities that pride themselves on educational excellence were funded by stolen Native lands. The American economy that generated unprecedented wealth grew from resources extracted from Indigenous territories. The stable nation-state that Americans take for granted exists because Native peoples were systematically dispossessed and their children traumatized. The path forward requires more than acknowledgement, it demands action. Returning stolen lands, funding language revitalization, supporting tribal sovereignty, ensuring accurate history education, providing reparations for stolen childhoods and destroyed families. These aren't acts of charity but obligations incurred by centuries of systematic abuse. The boarding school system created debts that compound with interest each year they remain unpaid. As we face contemporary challenges around education, child welfare, and cultural diversity, the boarding school history provides essential warnings. When we hear proposals to help children by removing them from their cultures, we should remember boarding schools. When education is proposed as a solution that requires abandoning heritage, we should remember boarding schools. When any group claims the right to determine what's best for other people's children, we should remember boarding schools. The dark truth about Native American boarding schools isn't just historical, it's a living reality that continues to shape Indigenous lives and American society. Every Native person carries this history in their cells, their memories, their family stories. Every American institution that participated, churches, schools, governments, bears responsibility for repair. The boarding schools may have closed, but their work of healing has only just begun. Understanding this history isn't about dwelling in the past but about recognizing how it created the present and determining what kind of future we'll build together. The children who disappeared into boarding schools, who died far from home, who survived but never fully healed, they deserve more than historical footnotes. They deserve a country that confronts what was done in its name, communities that support healing rather than perpetuating harm, and future generations who learn from this darkness to create light. The truth about boarding schools is dark indeed, but acknowledging that darkness is the first step toward dawn.